So a good question about independent education evaluations. Am I allowed to request an individual education evaluation after the eligibility decision has already been made? Yes. In fact, that's the best time to ask. And it doesn't matter whether it's an initial eligibility, meaning your child's never had an IEP before, or whether it's part of a reevaluation to where you have major questions about determinations of continued eligibility, eligibility category, which we call identification under the law. It doesn't matter, or whether any of that information is being used to, let's say, discontinue specific services like speech language or OT or use as present levels of performance for goal development. It just does not matter, guys. Your right to an independent education evaluation at public expense, understand the difference. You always have a right to an independent education evaluation at your expense. School cannot do anything about that. So there are two different kinds of independent education evaluations. One, you have a right to at any point. That is any that you fund, that you acquire, that you want to share with the IEP team for good faith consideration, which they must do. They must give your evaluations that you pay for and you bring to the table good faith consideration. Then you have the other independent education evaluation that's referenced in the law, and that is one at public expense, meaning that you choose the evaluator, they pay the bill. Okay? You choose the evaluator, they pay the bill. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say this. Some schools will hand you a list and they'll say you have to choose from this list. That is not true. That is a fiction. That's a lie. What the law requires is that the school provide a list because some parents just don't know what providers are in a geographic area. But at the same time, it is just there as a reference, as a tool of convenience if you don't know what providers are out there. The only thing a school can do is limit you in what's called agency criteria, and that's in three areas. They got to charge the community rate for, let's say, a psychologist or an OT, speech language for the same kind of evaluations, which I don't know of any professionals that I've sought that are outside of that community rate. They can't dictate what that community rate is, by the way. The school can't. It's whatever that community rate is. All right. The other one is they can limit you to geographic boundary. Let's say 100 miles from your school district. And then the other one is licensure. They can limit your choice to licensure. You have to be licensed in your state. There are rare instances to where, depending on where you live, you could live in right next to a neighboring state. And most schools in that will sit there and say, well, we'll accept licensure from the neighboring state as well, just as a convenience. But at the same time, these are the three areas where they have some control to dictate who you can or cannot use. But that's very, very limited, all right, to those three areas. Licensure, geography, and then community rate, okay? So independent education evaluation at public expense. When can you get them? Well, you can get them after the school conducts their own in-house evaluations. Now, if they did a psychological, meaning an IQ and an achievement, then you would be entitled to request in writing that you get an independent education evaluation at public expense in those areas. But if they also did an OT, you could potentially get an OT. The school also did a speech language. You could potentially request an independent education evaluation at public expense in speech language. As long as the school did an evaluation or an assessment in a particular area, you can request an independent education evaluation at public expense in that area. You're not limited to one, okay? It just has to be in that area where the school had already done one. The school only has two choices at that point. They can either agree to fund it or they file due process against you to defend their evaluations. Most schools don't do that because it's expensive to challenge in due process. Also, the burden of proof shifts in most states. It shifts over to the person that files the complaint. So in this situation, the school would have the burden of proof, not you. You have a right to request it. They would have a responsibility to show why their evaluations were fine and that you have no right to a second opinion, which is really stupid. But most schools don't do that. Most schools will fund it. The other thing is you don't really have to provide a hardcore reason why you disagree. You're not an expert in this area. You're not an expert in psychological assessments. Um, so if you give them, you don't necessarily have to give them an answer, but I would give them some kind of answer. Otherwise, some schools will sit there and say, well, you're just doing this to retaliate against us. And that's where you end up having the schools that will file to protect their own internal evaluations, is when they get this hint that some parents are doing this to try to be difficult. Okay. So if you're providing some kind of logical answer, like, in my heart of hearts, I just feel like we need a second review of this. The mass majority of the time, the school will sit there and agree to pay for it. But they can't delay. They cannot delay. That is a big, big no-no, and many schools unfortunately do that. So they need to provide you an answer fairly quickly. I'd say within like 1 or 2 weeks, and get that ball rolling, guys. Otherwise, they're at real risk of getting hammered when it comes to uh, being challenged, let's say, in a due process case for not complying with that request. You would have sort of a slam dunk case if they delayed their response to either pay for one or file a due process complaint. Um, that sums it up.